Okay, we are starting chapter 11 today, which covers the urinary system, our next body system. Chapter 11, we are going to look at sections 1 through 4. So remember, for each of our body systems, we are only responsible for the assigned reading. We're going to be answering these following questions. What are the functions of the urinary system? What parts of the body make up the urinary system? How is urine formed? So we're going to be looking at some of the physiological aspects of how that happens, and then what is it made out of once it is formed? And what role do the kidneys play in maintaining our body's homeostasis? Lots of things happening in the kidneys for the urinary system. The first major function of the urinary system is to eliminate waste from the body through a process called excretion. So we're going to be excreting some of the waste products from different processes of metabolism. So in the body systems we've already covered, we have seen a few other examples of wastes being removed from the body. For example, the respiratory system that we just finished was getting rid of carbon dioxide, a byproduct of cellular respiration. The digestive system was getting rid of undigested food and the things we couldn't absorb through that process of digestion. The urinary system, though, specializes in the excretion of nitrogenous wastes, so wastes that are largely made of nitrogen. And also some excess ions that collect in the blood from some of the other body's processes. We'll see other examples of things that get lost in urine as well, but the big bulk of what the process of the formation of urine does is remove nitrogenous wastes from the body. And nitrogenous wastes are produced when the body breaks down proteins. So we remember that amino acids that make up proteins are largely made of nitrogen. And as amino acids are broken down, they form a compound called ammonia, NH4. And ammonia is very toxic to our cells. And because it's so toxic, when it's present in the body, it's going to immediately combine with carbon dioxide, another toxic substance floating around in our bloodstream, immediately combine with carbon dioxide to form a slightly less toxic substance called urea. So here we're getting to kind of the foundation of urine, right? Creating something less toxic out of two rather toxic substances. The body also will make a substance called uric acid when it is processing nucleotides. And nucleotides we haven't seen yet. We'll see those as the building blocks of our DNA and our RNA. But just like amino acids, nucleotides are largely made out of nitrogen. So both of these nitrogen-based substances will be filtered out of the blood and excreted or gotten rid of by the urinary system. The urinary system also works to maintain and stabilize the levels of water and salts in the blood. So this is an example of what we call our salt-water balance, and this happens to be one of our body's mechanisms of homeostasis. We saw that the concentration of salts or solutes can affect the movement of water, affect the direction and rate of osmosis. So if the concentration of salt in the bloodstream is higher than the surrounding cells, in which direction will water flow? Out of the blood or into the blood? If concentration of salt in the bloodstream is higher than the surrounding cells, hopefully you said that water will flow into the bloodstream, which makes the volume of our blood higher and increases our blood pressure. So the urinary system, one of its other jobs is to filter out these excess ions, these excess salts, like sodium and potassium ions, from the blood to make sure that not too much water is being added to the bloodstream, and this helps to keep our blood pressure stable. So it's going to, all the kidneys, we'll meet them in just a second, are also going to be removing sodium and potassium ions from the bloodstream so that the solute concentration doesn't get too high and we're not adding too much water to the blood and increasing our blood pressure. And we're also going to be removing excess hydrogen ions. And hopefully when you see that all-important hydrogen ion, you're thinking back to maybe our discussion of pH. And we've seen that hydrogen ions, when dissolved in water, lowers the pH, makes the substance more acidic. So if hydrogen ions begin to build up in our blood, the pH will change. And we want to maintain our blood pH at about 7.4. And urine is often slightly acidic because we eat quite a few acidic foods, soda, tomatoes, that kind of thing. And those extra hydrogen ions are then filtered out and excreted by our urinary system. So those second two examples, the regulation of our water-salt balance and of our acid-base balance, are really the keys to how the kidneys function to maintain our body's homeostasis. Speaking of the kidneys, let's look at some of the pieces that make up the urinary system, do all of those functions. The kidneys are really the workhorses of the urinary system. This is where the blood is filtered and all of those nitrogenous waste products and excess ions are removed. And then we'll see in just a bit that the structure of the kidney looks very similar to the structure of the spleen or a lymph node that we saw when we were looking at the lymphatic system, which really makes sense because both of those organs and all of those pieces are filtering blood and removing unwanted items. So that's kind of another example of that form follows function. They just specialize in removing different things. But anything that the kidneys remove from the bloodstream will then be made into urine. So the urine travels, it's made in the kidneys, and then it travels down the ureters and into the urinary bladder. So we have two ureters, one coming from each one of our kidneys, but they both drain into the same urinary bladder. And then we all know that urine is a liquid most of the time, but some of those toxic products that are added to urine to be removed from the body, they have a tendency to crystallize into solids. So the body doesn't want to leave anything to chance that anything will get stuck in those really, really thin ureters. They're only about 5 millimeters in diameter. So this is another place in the body where we're going to see peristaltic movement. So we're going to have those two layers of smooth muscle, longitudinal and circular, working in opposite directions to physically move things through the ureters. This is also why you can still fill your bladder even when you're laying down. Once that bladder is full, the urine leaves the body through the urethra. In a female, like in the picture, oh, no, this is a male. In a male, like in the picture here, the urethra carries both urine and the reproductive fluids, luckily not at the same time. But unfortunately for females, because our urethra is so much shorter than a male's, it also makes us slightly more susceptible to bacterial infections of the urinary tract. So really just the length of the urethra making that difference there, more exposed to the outside. So let's look at the all-important kidney that we've mentioned a couple of times. This image is a cross-section of a kidney, so we can kind of see what's going on inside. I hope that you see that the structure similarities that it has to the spleen and the lymph nodes when we looked at those. And the kidney has three main regions. The outermost region, the most superficial region, if you will, is called the cortex, or the renal cortex. Renal just means related to the kidney. The next deeper layer past the cortex is called the renal medulla. And the medulla layer contains what we call the renal pyramids, which we'll see very soon is where all of the filtering activities that we were talking about happens. So these guys here, this is a renal pyramid right here. That's going to be housed in the medulla layer. And then the third layer is called the renal pelvis, which is the space that is open here. This is hollow and not filled with any tissue. And that's where the urine that is formed in the renal pyramids will drain down into the ureter and into the bladder and then out of the body. there are teeny tiny structures jam-packed inside the pyramids of the medulla layer, and these are called nephrons. So really we say the kidneys are like the workhorse of the urinary system, but it's actually these nephrons that are doing all of the work. Those are the filtering elements of the kidney. So we will look at those next. First, the anatomy of a nephron, and then we'll look at some of the physiology of how substances are moving into and out of the nephron to remove or add things back into our bloodstream. So first, the anatomy of a nephron, the pieces that make up the pyramids of the medulla layer. And these are the parts that are doing all of the work to pull those waste products from the bloodstream and send them on their way to be removed from the blood. So because their purpose is to filter things out of the blood, each nephron in the kidney has to have its own blood supply. Every single one of those nephrons has its own blood supply. So blood is going to enter the kidney, coming away from the heart, right, through the renal artery. And for every single nephron, of which we have millions, for every single nephron, it's going to have this glomerular capsule, or Bowman's capsule. And that capsule is surrounding the glomerulus, which is a little kind of ball of capillary-sized arteries that's going to be supplying blood to each individual nephron. That capsule forms a C shape around the capillary bed, and during the process of urine formation, we're going to see a lot of products passed back and forth between the bloodstream and the nephron. In order to do that, there also must be a blood supply to the other parts of the nephron, and those are all of these other blood vessels, this capillary bed embedded in the nephron that you see. So through the process of making urine, we're actually going to see things passed back and forth between what we'll call the filtrate, which is what's inside the nephron, and the bloodstream. So back and forth, it's going to go in both directions. But as urine is formed, we're going to follow this pathway. Blood will first be filtered through the glomerulus into the glomerular capsule. And then that filtrate, which we'll talk about more in just a second, will travel through this proximal convoluted tubule. Convoluted, we know to just mean twisted, right? Lots of twists and turns. Proximal means closer to the glomerulus. So first through the proximal convoluted tubule, then it will travel down into what we call the loop of the nephron. So this is the part that's going to dip down into that medulla layer. And it's going to go down the descending loop and up the ascending loop. And then that filtrate will travel through the distal convoluted tubule, which again means twisted, distal meaning further distance away from the glomerulus. Distal convoluted tubule, and all of those nephrons will then deposit the filtrate that they form into a collecting duct, which will go down into the ureter to be exited from the body. So keep in mind the structure and the anatomy of this nephron, because in the next video, we're going to go through that process of urine formation in a lot more detail. But we wanted to make sure we know what that nephron looks like first. See you there.